I have 35. I have 335. Okay, should we start?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I want to welcome everyone to our second annual Jewish Studies um, talk lecture. Today, we are very happy. I say by we, I mean this is a joint presentation of the Jewish Studies program along with the Taubman program, who's been very helpful in getting this off the ground. We are very happy to welcome Hindi Naiman from the University of Oxford to speak to us today. She is uh, I actually think she's expecting me to say how I met her. I think she will remember that when she was a student and I wasn't, I attended an introductory course, or I audited an introductory course on the Jerusalem Talmud. And this was an introductory course unlike anything I had known because I didn't understand a word of it. And it turned out the teacher didn't understand how to present an introductory course. So I was struggling. Hindi was next to me. We hadn't met. And she leaned over and said, "Do you need help?" And boy, did I. And since that time, we've been friends and we've maintained contact. Professor Naiman is a distinguished scholar. She started off at Notre Dame, where after 4 years, she held a chair, an academic chair. Today, she holds an academic chair as well. And between her first job at Notre Dame and her current job at Oxford, she spent some time in my alma mater and some others, Yale. She is a prodigious writer. She has written 3 books, mostly on early biblical interpretation, early Jewish biblical interpretation. She is on the editorial board of 6, or she's on 6 editorial boards that I can count. She has written on a number of topics, ranging from Jewish wisdom to, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which will interest my students, angels, early biblical interpretation, pseudepigrapha, women, genre, and I believe philo. So it is my actually absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Hindi Naiman, who is the Oriel. Is it right? Is that right? Oriel?
Close. Oriel is perfect.
Okay. Oriel and Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture at Oriel College at Oxford. And she will be speaking today on Poesis, vitality, and forward-moving philology in ancient Judaism. So I present Professor Naiman.
Thank you. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I'm terribly sorry that I couldn't be there with you to speak with you in person and to meet your wonderful community, your colleagues and your students. But we hope at a future time this will be possible. I too remember that year that you spent at Harvard and very long walks about Talmud, about historical Hebrew, about Proto-Northwest Semitic, and many other topics. So it's my absolute delight and honor to speak to your community today.
Actually, before you start, I forgot to say that we will be fielding questions through the Q&A apparatus on Zoom. They'll come to me, and then at the end of the talk, I will present them to our speakers. So if you have any questions, please submit them through that Q&A mechanism. And now I give the floor back to our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And what I'll share with you today is part of a larger book project, which will be published next year. And this is really the framework for the project, which means to challenge notions of reconstructing a past tradition and instead understanding antiquity, and in particular ancient Judaism, to be a vital and vibrant part of the history of the religion to this very day. So my focus on vitality is part of a larger commitment to rethink the direction of textual work for the study of the ancient world. Instead of reconstructing the archetype or the originary moment, I'm focused on a forward-moving gesture which considers the convergence between Hebrew and Greek in a larger interdisciplinary context of language, culture, reading, and understanding. The chronological focus of this paper then is the Hellenistic period. It's considered the latest period of biblical production and biblical writing, approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era, and then the 2 or 3 centuries following. To call the Hellenistic period a period of vitality, or to make the subject matter the focus of this period, is quite surprising, given that the history of the study of Hebrew Bible has not really focused on this later period as a period of creativity and revitalization. This is the period, of course, where Hebrew and Greek culture were integrated, and people have often talked about this as being a supplementary or a less important or a less original period. My claim then is this period, the Hellenistic period, is a period of radical innovation, deep and complex engagement with the Greek philosophical tradition, and fundamentally formative for the history of Judaism itself. This will be true for Jewish philosophy, for mysticism, for commentary traditions, as well as interpretation and midrash. And finally, also for traditions of performance and the foundations for understanding grammar. The earliest translations of what comes to be called the Septuagint, that is the Greek Bible, and the narrative around the letter of Aristeas, are just the tip of the iceberg for what I am describing. What we've come to understand is that the Hellenistic period is one of poesis, by which I mean poetic or creative imagination, from the Greek verb poeo, new innovative compositions, practices of refinement, editing, and expansions. So we have legal, prayer texts, scribal texts, and prophetic texts that continue to be produced. Some of these texts are included in the biblical materials, but many of them are not. And we can find them based on the findings, the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also Hellenistic Jewish texts. In any event, on this account, the destruction of the first temple in 586, and then the second temple's destruction in 70 CE, did not interrupt the creativity or the spirit of Judaism. On the contrary, I argue there was even more growth in dynamic production. And this is what I've meant in some of my earlier work, where I spoke of a period of destruction, not as an end to prophecy, but rather as the beginning of prophecy, inflected by destruction. Different from what had been, to be sure, but resilient and sustained. Linguistically, philologically, Hebrew was transformed, and a new vernacular and a new literary dialect was born in this period. This is true for language, but also true for the philosophical and the poetic imagination. I consider this new compositional activity to be part of an ever-growing literary imagination. Even more, this period we see an increasing expansion and revision of existing literary and scribal traditions, as well as rich iconic traditions evidenced in ancient Jewish synagogues, Jewish manuscript traditions, but also in the vivid depictions of deity, the cosmos, the monarchy, and later textual traditions. So my interest in vitality grows out of two essential points. First, I'm critical of scholarship in my own field of biblical studies, which focuses on a single fetishized uniformity and retrospective moments for texts and concepts. The discipline of biblical studies has privileged early, originary moments or expressions of ancient Israelite religion and an original text, which is then said to be replaced by or superseded through early Christianity. I mean to critique these theological presuppositions for reading and thinking about Israelite religion and ancient Judaism in the 19th century. This approach of trying to reconstruct an original text was criticized by very important figures, both in the classical philosophical tradition and in the Jewish tradition, such as Friedrich Schlegel or Gershom Scholem. This is what Scholem famously called a distortion. Scholem famously called the distortion of the study of Judaism. He called it a dissection of a corpse instead of a vital and living, breathing tradition caught in the dynamic helix of halacha, law, and agadah, interpretation, along with the retelling of narrative. It's not insignificant to talk about a dissection of corpse in the context of the 1960s, when Scholem is talking about the revitalization of Judaism and the creation of the field of the study of Judaism in the academy. So in my argument here, 19th century historicism and a backward-oriented approach to reading text, that is the recovery of the earliest language and the study of language, were indebted to assumptions that presupposed the replacement of Judaism with Christianity, otherwise known as supersessionism. But my critique really goes well beyond the 19th century historicists. For biblical studies and ancient Judaism as well, methods for reading and for creating textual editions, that is, the editions that are made that we read from and work from and study in the academy, moved from academic trend to dogma, as the literary analysis became caught up in a supersessionist and decidedly negative agenda against Judaism. So that later forms of biblical thinking, rabbinic interpretation, and law were presented as a later and less authentic form of Israelite thinking, now in the form of Judaism, said to be derivative, inauthentic, and as bereft of spirit, or late Judaism, which is called Spät Judentum in the German scholarship. Scholarship about Judaism then in the hands of Old Testament and New Testament scholars continued to repeat a narrative that buried Judaism and denied that it had an organic and ongoing afterlife. This manifested itself in a number of different ways in the academy. While many of these expressions were not self-consciously or wittingly anti-Jewish, they nevertheless continued a narrative of replacement or supersessionism and an antagonism towards Mosaic law and halacha, often referred to as antinomianism. This had its roots in anti-Jewish sentiments that stemmed from early Christianity, and especially in readings and interpretations of the New Testament and the early church fathers. My alternative then to this narrative is a forward-moving philology, borrowing from Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, which embraces pluriformity of texts and diversity of manuscript traditions and textual version over and against a uniformed archetype, which presupposed rupture and replaced a one-time occurrence. Language and concepts teach us that there is a continuum of transition from the life of the previous culture, which lives on in the new phase of that language and interpretive community. This is true for culture, for language, and for concepts. And this is part of what I mean by vitality and looking forward. So my second use of the term vitality is a critique of the history of scholarship that ancient Judaism should be studied as a forward-moving organism. And I mean to rethink and challenge the inherited assumptions that shaped the reception and articulation of biblical studies in its formation in the 19th century. So through texts, manuscripts, scrolls, mosaics, prayers, and ritual objects, my current project that I share with you this evening argues that Judaism is alive and dynamic to its past, its future, and its present, and that Hellenistic Judaism is part of this vital history. This is in no sense linear. Rather, the texts grow across chronological and cultural and linguistic borders, from the biblical to the extra-biblical, from the Hebrew to the Greek, from the Aramaic to the Ethiopic, and demonstrate ongoing and resilient recreating of the past in ways that carry the past into the future. Instead of arguing for a borrowing of culture or the imposition of Greek culture onto Hebrew culture, I prefer to speak of convergence. The texts that we have from the Hellenistic period show signs of life, of continuity of breath, of memory within the texts themselves and in the reception of those texts in the context of new writings and compositions, as well as pluriform and plurilingual expressions. Here I am speaking about the period of Hellenism, where we can already chart the writing and expansion of biblical traditions across linguistic, cultural, and chronological divides. But it is also the case that the biblical corpus from the earliest discernible historical contexts also exhibits revivification through Babylonian and later Persian traditions. What is important to recognize is that our biblical traditions have rich histories embedded within the texts, as well as in the reception, beyond the text that we have come to read and transmit them in, that is the canon of the Hebrew Bible. The biblical texts then are layered with history, internal dialogue, and revision. My goal is to understand the complex of the history and hermeneutics embedded within and beyond the text, to show how the text preserved a dynamic conversation of reception, of hermeneutics, and innovation. Reception of earlier tradition, interpreting and updating those earlier traditions, and also the incorporation and inclusion of new cultural insights and philological innovations through borrowing, influence, and poetic creativity is what is seen across these texts. So I want to turn to 4 different ways to express the vitality of which I speak. I offer correctives then within scholars and scholarship and suggest new directions in the context of reflecting on a forward-moving approach to philology. First, I want to consider an integrated approach to thinking about biblical texts which exhibit history in the context of composition. And here is where I'm going to challenge reconstructing an original layer in the biblical text. I'm going to look at a text from the Pentateuch, which is going to be the first text on your handout. Second, I will consider texts that rework earlier biblical narratives as new performance and articulation of past, instead of reducing these to new compositions as just mere rewritings, rather creative new work. Third, I want to highlight the fact that pluriformity in manuscripts from this period in the production of ancient Jewish texts, and focus on pluriformity, that is, it comes up in multiple forms, instead of thinking that we must reconstruct a single moment in time that is prior to the texts themselves. And then finally, to point to a revitalization of ancient Judaism through a period of integration and transformation in conversation with Hellenism. I will consider the role of Hellenism in ancient Judaism, Hebrew Bible, Second Temple Judaism, and rabbinics, not as late Judaism, Spätjudentum, but rather as a new revitalization of ancient Jewish thinking, which is integrated and reoriented in the face of Greco-Roman philosophy and culture. I want to rethink then the presuppositions about compositional practices with respect to the assembly and production of what has come to be called the Bible, especially with respect to research on Pentateuch. And here I'm going to share with you a forthcoming article with my colleague from the University of Zurich, Konrad Schmid. And we thought a lot about the Pentateuch in this context, especially the plague cycle. For this aspect of vitality, I want to consider construction, or the writing, composition of literary wholes, which do not necessarily presuppose the canonical whole. I don't want to reconstruct historical layers of the text, nor to reconstruct the earliest part of the text. That is, I'm not pursuing the originary moment or the early part as though that would redeem us or the text. Nevertheless, history and composition provide the focus. The claim is that the reader is expected to engage in a practice of exegesis that can overcome the gapping or interruption due to the compositional history of the text. Or in other words, readers are challenged by the text to make sense of contradiction in a way that forces them to inherit multiple traditions through exegetical strategies that involve making sense of scripture. One should keep in mind then that the quest for unambiguousness in reading is to a large extent a modern focus. Our texts from biblical and Jewish antiquity have embedded compositional histories which are left transparently on the surface for all of us to see and engage. This is true across biblical traditions in a variety of ways. The Pentateuch, conflicting and inconsistent narratives of Sinai embedded in a single pericope, or the choosing of King David or Saul, that is, multiple versions of the creation of the world, also show pluriformity. No attempt is made to erase the complexity of a composite work in our biblical texts. And so, to read these texts, even today, is also to participate in the history of the text, because one must participate in a practice of interpretation as a way of preserving the inconsistencies, the gaps, and the interruptions in the narratives. In some, these gaps or interruptions are part of the artistry of the text and inherent to the compositional practices themselves. The text, therefore, participates in and is a product of a long and complex history of composition. To compose in antiquity was to record tradition, but also to read existing tradition and to engage with it. The ancient writers and readers perhaps knew how these texts came about, and they were committed not to producing a seamless linear narrative, but to preserving differences. And this integrated mode of reading can contribute to understanding a whole and thus pave a way to a new hermeneutic for reading biblical narrative. My own critique is formed in part by a critical orientation to existing scholarship, notably a recent critique of neo-documentarianism. This movement proposes and advances a revival and a refinement of the so-called documentary hypothesis for explaining the composition of the Pentateuch, and its notion of a mechanical compiler of the Pentateuch. The compiler of the Pentateuch is said to have produced an unintelligible text by limiting himself to, quote, preserving intact the precise verbal form of each one of the four sources to the greatest extent possible, and intervening, altering, adding, deleting, or rearranging only when absolutely unavoidable. When looking at the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls, such a conclusion seems utterly improbable in light of the pluriform nature of biblical texts and also the variegated nature of their articulation and performance. I will return to the matter of pluriformity a little later. For the point here is that the texts as we have them are not fixed, and they are preserved across linguistic and manuscript traditions with variation. In addition to an explicit critique of the state of affairs in current Pentateuchal scholarship that subscribes to a neo-documentary approach, I want to think about a forward-moving practice which can be demonstrated in a reading of the Pentateuch and more generally in the Hebrew Bible and a whole host of biblical traditions from the Hellenistic period as well. This is one could call a larger discourse about compositional history and the vitality of texts through their expansion, deletion, and revision. Here the focus is not only the Pentateuch, but also other biblical and non-canonical works. To be sure, the various traditions, collections, and biblical books are not uniformly the same in any real way. So while Proverbs might be called anthological, Jeremiah might be considered a collection of oracular and historiographical traditions around the figure of Jeremiah and other prophetic figures and textualized prophetic traditions. So instead of focusing on differentiating different genre or kinds of collections or assemblies of traditions, I take also a progressive approach towards composition. By progressive, I mean to approach biblical traditions focusing on compositional history and textual unity when one considers compositional practice and the dynamic development between traditions enmeshed into single compositions. I will briefly mention one example taken from the Pentateuch, a passage from the plague cycle in Exodus. Instead of using contradictions within the text of Exodus to look backwards to expose the text as unreadable or as fragmentary, I want to consider these different layers of the text to study the dynamic development of scriptural traditions, which preserve historical complexity and embedded hermeneutics. It is to be expected, of course, that the composers of the plague cycle, and here please look at text 1 on your handout, Exodus 7, verses 14 to 25, or of the Pentateuch more generally, had a strategy for assembly as well as a strategy for what it is to read the text. The text has an embedded compositional history, which is left transparently at the surface for all to see and engage. As I mentioned already, no attempt is made to erase the complexity of this work. And so to read the text today is also to participate in the history of the text, because we must participate in a practice of exegesis in order to understand the text. In some, these interruptions or contradictions are part of the artistry of the text and inherent to the composition itself. This reading then for vitality instead of deconstruction is conducted in this essay with attention to the literary structure into compositional history, but also with an eye towards rendering comprehensively a text that is layered and entangled across history. Thus, My approach maintains that one can begin to think about the text as a whole if one also attends to the historical composition as conversations between traditions that set up what comes to be called the priestly source or the Deuteronomic source, or the priestly and the non-priestly traditions, or D or E or J. So for example, one example of a scholar I'm disagreeing with, Baruch Schwartz describes the combined text of Exodus 7 that you have before you, which serves as his test case, as quote, the results of this analysis of the account of the plague of blood are not the exception but the rule. He calls this text unintelligible. He says we read literary chaos. Schwartz says the contradictions, redundancies, discontinuities, and differences of terminology make the canonical Torah wholly unintelligible. In contrast, in exposing the various layers and units that are embedded in a single text, it's possible perhaps to mark the extensive and complex and even intricate interrelationality between a whole series of texts within and beyond Exodus 7 itself. This facilitates the perceiving not only of compositional layers, but also of editorial practices. So I agree with Schwartz that there are tensions, but I'm explaining them in very different ways. The practices of containing and including texts or traditions that are in tension with each other are compositional and editorial. That is, these traditions can be considered overlapping and even at times isomorphic. They equal each other. To look at these traditions provides us with a window onto the history of religion in ancient Israel with respect to concepts of deity, redemption, perfection of the human, specifically with respect to the priestly aspiration to become godlike, as well as the idea of Israel as God's people. All of these ideas can be unveiled through the marking of interrelationality of narratives and sources across the Pentateuch and beyond. This is just a small glimpse of that complexity embedded within Exodus 7, which both generates a dialogue between priestly and non-priestly materials, but also and at once is engaged with the history of biblical text through collection and editing and careful interweaving of allusion and hermeneutics within and beyond the text. In the context then of thinking about vitality, I want us to also think about the production and preservation of traditions preserved in such a way to both exhibit tension, but also to generate new reading and response. Unitary logical or literary coherence is not then a goal for the composers of this plague cycle that you have in front of you, but rather an integrated literary whole appears to be an end result of the composers, collectors, and editors. The text survived in a complex integration and seems to perform a clear and complex attempt at preserving different traditional perspectives. Thomas Bauer identified a specific intellectual approach to the problem of ambiguities in pre-modern Islam that he called the culture of ambiguity. By this term, he meant that ancient cultures did not necessarily strive to make any intellectual, social, or political ambiguity unequivocal in order to live with it. Rather, they tried to balance ambiguities in order to maintain different, sometimes even contradicting, but nevertheless legitimate perspectives side by side. It was only by the process, argues Bauer, of the Islamization of Islam that this culture in Islam, this culture of ambiguity, was challenged and in certain parts of the Islamic tradition finally lost. The modern reader is interested in unlocking the text for the purposes of her or his own reading. Maybe the ancient authors who composed wanted to maintain various philosophical and theological dimensions of the text in the sense of Bauer, and this was at the expense of the overall coherence. The entirety of the Exodus narrative can be read as the result of a creative hermeneutics that weaves together previously existing narratives, in the case of priestly and non-priestly traditions, now into a new whole. The process that is being traced here reveals both the oral and performative dimension, as well as the literary dimensions of the Exodus text. The end product is a text that remains alive to its readers, or in other words, conflation creates commentary. Perhaps then what is needed is a different scholarly reading practice to understand these texts. The solution cannot be to disintegrate the narrative into parts. Rather, expressions of inconsistency or contradiction are preserved for a whole host of possible reasons of tradition or of integration of communities with competing traditions. Perhaps one can take a step further and suggest that collectors and editors did not prioritize a smooth or seamless integration. Could the default option of biblical editors not have been to create a coherent, streamlined narrative, but rather to integrate as much as they could from existing traditions? The particular way in which biblical texts were composed demands that readers participate in the hermeneutic that is embedded in the text itself. No one in the scholarly field contests the assumption that the Pentateuch is composite, but the task as scholars go beyond disintegrating or even dismembering the Pentateuch in its various sources. Can scholars take a hermeneutical turn in Pentateuch studies to develop a way of reading that takes into account the ambiguities that its authors and redactors produced, which are responsible for the dynamic nature both of the text itself and its reception history? A text is like a movie. Just as it's possible to break the movie down into static frames, so we can break the text down into reconstructed sources. In some sense, the movie is composed out of frames and the text out of layers. But if we look only at the frames separately, we will not understand the flow of the movie, let alone the connections that exist at a holistic level between this movie and other movies with which it's interacting. Similarly, if we look only for the sources of the text, we risk missing the flow of the text, which not only gives it unity, but which also unites it with other scriptural texts that participate in the same creative process. Progressive, then, is used as a way of capturing the proposal for the reading I want to call vital and dynamic. This use of progressives does not assume progress in the sense of teleology, a goal-oriented or linear forward movement. The approach enables readers to consider the history of the document and at the same time to make sense of what it is to read the whole of a composite text. It's not a straightforward matter to read a text with a complex history with compositional layers. To be sure, scholars may acknowledge that all texts have histories, so that even the most ancient readings reflect histories of editing, deletions, refinements, and accretions. But a text such as Exodus also preserves competing as well as parallel narratives that are embedded as part of a whole, or what one might call a textual unity. To be sure, one must acknowledge the complexity of the text, but nevertheless, it's important to note that the ancient biblical texts are readable not only through an uncritical lens, but also through a hypercritical lens. That is to say, to perceive an assembled whole, one can nevertheless speak to the interpretive traditions that make up the whole. Moreover, critical reading can be generative for narrative and for meaning without having to ignore the complexity of the very history and contradiction that it identifies. This seems like an obvious point to make, but it's important to make this explicit in order to respond to the strands of current scholarship that abandon any claims of a qualified hermeneutical profile of its composite text. To be sure, this position is not unheard of in the earlier history of biblical scholarship. I want to speak then about a philology, literally a love for language or a study of words, lexical items, and the study of grammar that both presupposes the rigors of etymology and grammar, but moves beyond that mode by applying it to a practice of reading, which is intricate and interwoven with respect to the work or collection. And this is the second text on your handout from a 20th century literary theorist from Hungarian German background, Peter Sandi. Philological knowledge, he argues, possesses a dynamic aspect that is peculiarly its own. This is not because, like every other kind of knowledge, it is constantly being altered by new points of view and new findings, but because it can exist in the first place only through constantly confronting text, through constantly referring knowledge back to its source in cognition, that is to say, by relating it to the understanding of the poetic world. Sandi's approach is deeply indebted to the historical context, but with an eye towards what makes a text dynamic to itself and to its reading community. The processes of reading are a dynamic and vital project. This is within and beyond the text through readers, auditors, performers, and the response that the text or work asks of its readers. Hence, the notion of life after text, vitality of scripture, or even the continuation of a textual tradition in the context of a rereading and the work of interpretation is absolutely essential to understanding what is alive in writing. I came to understand that we could mark changes not only within a single text, but also through texts that participating in what had been called rewriting, or what I prefer to call rearticulation of old or existing tradition to generate new text through a variety of operations, through texts, images, mosaics, but also through charting the crystallization of particular concepts over time. Part of my critique came out of new findings about compositional and textual revision we can trace through the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the vital and dynamic information we were able to gather up also through the Cairo Geniza, the enormous finding in the 20th century of Jewish texts in Cairo, maps, legal texts, prayer texts, and interpretive Jewish texts found in a safe and protected space from almost 2,000 years ago. The Dead Sea Scrolls in particular demanded that we rethink and challenge a notion of a single archetype and instead reflect on the kind of pluriformity that someone like Peter Schaeffer exemplified in his magisterial edition of the Kabbalistic ascent literature known as Heichalot, or as two other scholars, Grunfeld and Heyman, demonstrated in the case of another mystical text about the heavens called the Book of Formation, Sefer Yetzirah, which is a great example of how there was not just a singular version out of which any variation, corruption, or error emerged. My main point here, though, is that pluriformity is a way of tracing the life and breadth of a text. It challenges us not to think in terms of a fixed text, but rather in terms of an identity of a corpus which has a great deal of flexibility. Part of that flexibility is variation, which can suggest a vibrant and dynamic understanding of versions, as opposed to retrospective reconstruction. Another part of that flexibility is about the way in which Scripture not only exhibits vitality through pluriformity, but also through a variety of ways of articulation, through composition of new Scripture and of early forms of reading practices. Here I have in mind Pesher, Midrash, rewritings, the Aramaic Jewish tradition of translation, Targum, and more. So I want to then move to a second example where I want to consider how scholars have conceived of works that have been called rewritings. One Second Temple work, the Book of Jubilees from the 2nd century before the Common Era, was found in multiple copies and variation amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was also preserved in much later manuscript traditions, and it's especially important because in addition to it preserving rich midrashic traditions that are pre-midrashic or pre-rabbinic that we find from the 2nd century, the Book of Jubilees also became a very important text in the Ethiopic tradition as it became part of the biblical canon for the Ethiopian church. Jubilees is a work that rewrites the beginning of the book of Genesis through the middle of Exodus. As I have argued elsewhere, it appropriates a kind of interpretive authority by claiming angelic, divine, cosmic, calendrical, and heavenly authority, along with Mosaic and divine authority. In line with my thinking about vitality, I want to consider the role of articulation and performance of new reading. Here, a kind of vitality. Jubilee self-presentation as new scripture is essential to how hermeneutics is used to shape new ritual and new tradition. So on the one hand, it's rewriting Genesis to Exodus. On the other hand, it's creating a new tradition. Let's take a look at this. This is the next text on your handout. This is from the beginning of the Book of Jubilees, existing in about 17 identified copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, preserved in Latin, in Ethiopic, and as well as later traditions as well. Quote, these are the words regarding the divisions of the times, of the law, and of the testimony. Torah v'teudah, we know this phrase is directly from Isaiah 8:16, of the events of the years, of the weeks of their jubilees throughout all of the years of eternity, as he related them to Moses on Mount Sinai when he went up to receive the stone tablets, the law, and the commandments. On the Lord's order, as he had told him that he should come up to the summit of the mountain. And then I just gave you a little bit more so you could get a taste of this text. During the first year of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, in the 3rd month, on the 16th of the month, the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain. I'll give you the 2 stone tablets of law and the commandments which I've written. Verse 2, Moses went up the mountain to the Lord. The glory of the Lord took up residence on Mount Sinai. When he summoned Moses into the cloud on the 7th day, he saw the glory of the Lord like a blazing fire on the summit of the mountain. Moses remained there for 40 days and 40 nights. Skipping a line, he related to him the visions of all of the times, both of the law and the testimony. And then he said, pay attention to all of the words I tell you, write them in a book so that their offspring may see that I have not abandoned them because of all of the evil they have done in straying from the covenant between me and you, which I am making today on Mount Sinai for their offspring. So it will be when all of these things befall them, they will recognize that I have been more faithful than they in all of their judgments and in all of their actions. They will recognize I have been with them. There's a lot more to say about this passage and also the larger context where Jubilees continues to argue that there's a heavenly copy of the law and that the Torah as we know it is a copy of it. It's a re-articulation. So the interpretation of the law becomes prior to the actual articulation of the law of Moses itself, which is a radical interpretation, which perhaps we can talk about later on in the Q&A. Let me return now to the paper. Like philosophy, philology understands in retrospect, that is backwards. There's no alternative, but we run the risk, of course, of forgetting that the texts are part of a continuous, dynamic, and vital tradition that lived forwards. The community behind many of the scrolls, like Jubilees that we just saw from the 1940s and 50s that were discovered, as well as other Jews living and writing in antiquity, they were exploring a multiplicity of possible continuations, revitalizations of the traditions they had inherited. The fact that many of these ways of continuing died out for various reasons should not blind us to the fact that they were possible. We should not allow our own understanding of the vitality of ancient Judaism to be shaped by those elements that survived and gave rise to subject matters in fields such as Hebrew Bible or New Testament, rabbinics and early Christianity, instead, or to be limited to the canons that we have from later periods. Instead, we should embrace the opportunity to see ancient Judaism in flux in a dynamic way prior to the origination of these subject matters in the academy, when scriptural traditions were polyform and the possibilities for development had not been fully narrowed down. Rethinking the names even of many of the scrolls would be a good place. Many of the texts are called pseudo Ezekiel or pseudo Jeremiah. My point is that Jubilees is part of a dynamic textual performative tradition of dynamic survival, like living through a past, much like what Walter Benjamin has called Überleben. Let's take a look at these two short passages from Benjamin. Benjamin writes, the notion of the life and continuing life of works of art should be considered with complete unmetaphorical objectivity. Even in ages of the most prejudiced thinking, it has been suspected that life must not be attributed to organic corporeality alone. It's only when life is attributed to everything that has a history and not to that which is only a stage setting for history that this concept comes into its own. For the range of the living must ultimately be delimited on the basis of history and not of nature. And then one more passage from the same essay. Just as expressions of life are connected in the most intimate manner with the living being without having any significance for the latter, a translation proceeds from the original, not indeed so much from its life as from its living through a kind of survival, Überleben. Nonetheless, the translation is later than the original, and in the case of the most significant works, which never find their chosen translators in the area in which they are produced, indicates they have reached the stage of their continuing life, Fortleben. In other words, some texts have a vitality that expresses itself in the fact that they provide the basis for translations, for new texts and languages other than the original, that purport to say the same as the original text, although they're self-evidently different. I want to say the same about scriptures. Such texts have a vitality that expresses itself in the fact that they provide the basis for new texts. They live through or survive destruction through innovation. For example, they give rise to emulations that purport to say the same as the original scripture, although they are self-evidently different. Texts that claim to continue the voice of Moses or extend the law of Moses through repetition, rewriting, and even subversion, or texts that continue along the line of a particular tendency associated with a particular author, such as the biblical texts of Jeremiah and Lamentations, or texts that rewrite figures in history in order to create new texts like Chronicles or Jubilees that we just read. Texts that purport to be Mosaic claim sometimes to say the same as the various Pentateuchal texts, speaking in the voice of Moses or in the voice of an angel dictating to Moses, like Jubilees, or even in the voice of God, which is precisely what another text from the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Temple Scroll does. Thus, the framework into which Jubilees was included, that is, scriptural traditions, was already established even before the finding of the scrolls happened. That is, Jubilees is already participating in a tradition that is articulating and performing scripture through new works. My point is that this is part of what it is to read and perform scripture, namely to transform and re-articulate. So whether this happens in law codes or narrative retellings, this articulation is part of the life and survival of ancient Jewish tradition. It seems that the more we consider practices of reading and writing within the scrolls, it becomes even clearer that we are not confronting rewritten Bible any more than we are confronting medieval commentary traditions. This matters because it means that Jews in the Hellenistic period seem to be doing something rather different than rewriting. It means that the authors of Jubilees, or the chronicler, perhaps for that matter, is less bound by the biblical text that we as scholars have assumed the author or interpretive community is rewriting. Rather, there seems to be a freedom to continue to write, produce, and authorize what we might call new scripture. Jubilees is just one of a series of examples of this phenomenon. Other such examples are very different in style and form to Jubilees, but nevertheless played the same role with respect to what I want to call creativity and poesis in the Hellenistic period. Other texts which I would include in our conversations are texts such as Ezekiel the Tragedian, 4Q Instruction, the Hodayot, and Wisdom of Solomon. My central point here is that articulation, a new performance of earlier writings, is not about replacing the old or just rewriting the old, rather the revitalization of biblical text through new, innovative, and imaginative writing. I want to challenge the impression that Jubilees, for example, worked off of a fixed text from the Bible and should just be called a commentary. And yet, I still want to consider Jubilees as a text which we can come to understand, from which we can come to understand various concepts and beliefs that are at the center of Hellenistic Jewish thinking. Moreover, we can come to see how reading of earlier biblical traditions happens. In so doing, I'm not only considering Jubilees, but I'm considering how Jubilees is reading earlier texts, and also the way in which we can perceive Jubilees as being already read in the late Hellenistic period, and also to identify a whole group of texts that share these concepts. So while I'm pushing back on calling it a rewriting, it is the case that Jubilees belong somewhere in between the Book of Chronicles and 4th century rabbinic midrashic collections such as Genesis Rabbah. Even with citations, we do not yet see a fixed text that should be read as commentary. The question is really how to characterize that work if it's not simply a replacement or a commentary. And this is where I believe current work on pluriformity of biblical tradition on the one hand and the pre-canonical state of scripture on the other come into play. This is my third expression of vitality, the matter of pluriformity. Part of what I want to emphasize with vitality is that the impulse to reconstruct a single archetype does not map onto the textual witnesses we have. There is much more to be said about other important works that are preserved in a pluriform manner. The crucial point for me with respect to vitality is as follows. Pluriformity can be the growth and ongoing expansion of a tradition through ongoing writing and thinking about tradition. Relatedly, and relevant to vitality, is the way Jubilees and other texts discovered among the scrolls from the Dead Sea were assumed to have an archetype, that is, various copies, despite significant variations across the manuscript traditions, were said to be copies of Jubilees, retrospecting using a much later, ironically, using a much later Ethiopic manuscript to reconstruct an imagined earlier original text, or fragments were said to be pseudo-Jubilees, like Jubilees, but not Jubilees. This has been discussed extensively and recently suggested that pluriformity could be the norm. That is, there could be different versions of this text, and this is exactly how it's copied and transformed and transmitted. Ivor Techelar demonstrated that based on scrolls evidence, Jubilees is a work not unlike the Psalm scrolls that continues to be reworked and rewritten. The challenge Techelar poses to a general scholarly consensus about Jubilees leaves us then with a significant question. The Ethiopic has been used to reconstruct Jubilees, but the variegated nature of Jubilees and so-called pseudo-Jubilees scrolls and fragments might suggest that the formation of Jubilees in late Hellenistic periods, along with other such texts, are works in formation that continue to enjoy their own rewriting, reworking, and new possibility. This formation is ongoing through the history of copying, translation, manuscript emergence, and commentary. This is a twofold challenge to scholarship. One is our ongoing use of medieval manuscripts to reconstruct Hellenistic or Persian works, assuming a unified correspondence. The second is that we must recognize that texts we come to call the Bible continue to participate in this dynamic and ever-changing reworking that even when fixed can nevertheless be perceived in our biblical traditions. These questions take the challenge of canon to a completely new level. We're not asking about when the canon was formed. Rather, we're asking, when did biblical books themselves take shape, and what kind of possibilities were there for rewriting? So instead of reconstructing an text or an archetype, an original text, we can trace the vicissitudes of biblical traditions, traditions that have an identity, be it Jubilees, Exodus, Psalms, or Chronicles, but that are not fixed. This fluctuation speaks to the way in which these texts are in use and alive to liturgy, creative copying and correction, and of course to study and innovation. Similar critiques of a single manuscript have been made in the context of the Enochic materials by Lauren Stuckenbrook. In both of these cases and in so many others, we can understand the possibility and creativity of scribes who had agency to transform, create, and manipulate new and old texts in ways that kept the textual traditions alive. As I mentioned earlier, there are many ways in which vitality was a meaningful concept and continues to be today. I've considered composition and hermeneutics as forward-moving and vital. Pluriformity is an expression of ongoing and creative poetic composition, as well as articulation of narrative, which reperforms and transforms foundational narratives for a people and for their rituals. Having discussed compositional practices, performance and articulation, and pluriformity, all aspects of vitality, I will now briefly turn to my final and fourth example before moving to my concluding remarks. I want to consider one more way in which I want to think about vitality today, and that is how new concepts are integrated into ongoing production of compositions that exemplify cultural transfer and philological creativity. As a corrective to considering the Hellenistic period as one of late Judaism, I want to think about this period instead as one of tremendous creativity and revivification, of growth, of life. In 2002, I wrote a little bit about linguistic border crossing as a way of showing how concepts from the Hellenistic period cross between Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic. And a few years later, I spoke about concepts that are exhibited in what I called semantic constellations in 2017. Namely, they're concepts that are represented by a whole constellation of words or phrases such as repentance, archetype, inheritance, soul, subject, and nature. All of these are concepts that people have identified as Greek, but I want to argue that they're also Jewish and they're not simply borrowed. My point then is that these concepts get developed in Hebrew and Greek as the Jewish tradition emerges, not as terms that are not indigenous to Hebrew or to Jewish traditions, but rather as concepts that become essential part of what it is to be Jewish, to think theologically, philosophically, and also philologically. These terms become part of the narrative and they exhibit what it is for Hellenism to be Jewish and for the Jewish communities in the Hellenistic period to be integrated and acculturated. To be sure, this would be true in later periods, but also in pre-Hellenistic times, we can observe and remark on Babylonian and Persian integration. Examples of concepts and terms are paradigm, inheritance, imitation, nature, and mystery. While they all have expressions in earlier biblical traditions, they come to have new meaning in the Hellenistic context. So instead of referring to this as imposition or corrupting influence of the Greeks, which is not indigenous, I prefer, again, to think about this as vitality, a vitality which is generative for new words, for the development of Greek concepts in the Hellenistic period, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, are the ways in which Jewish traditions continue to be revised and transformed as tenacious and resilient expressions of vitality. My point then is that in the Hellenistic period, there is a revitalization of Judaism out of which is born early Jewish philosophical discourse. This is essential for the formative period of rabbinic Judaism, early Jewish mysticism, and what Solomon Schechter called the first Jewish theology. What we come to see are new expressions that are on the one hand already part of the Jewish hermeneutical and religious imagination, but they are developed and deepened in new dimensions. So we come to see discussions of higher and lower practices of reading in order to understand the whole terrestrial and heavenly framework. There is extensive discussion of natural phenomena in both Hebrew and Greek traditions. Finally, there are extensive engagements with scribal practices in the form of textual correction and refinement, also, but not only in the context of emerging commentary traditions. My focus on vitality then is not about a concern with the center and the periphery, the canonical or the apocryphal, the sectarian and the normative, or the apocalyptic versus the prophetic. These dichotomies and categorizations don't interest me because I think that for the purpose of the questions I'm asking of Jewish antiquity, they obscure far more than they illuminate. Instead, I consider textual evidence in Jewish antiquity for what it is, a vital and dynamic ever-growing and emerging tradition of creativity, resilience, imagination, and ritual. But I want to explore it with a conceptual and philosophical framework, which is deeply marked by scholars who have shaped my own thinking and have opened up pathways for me to read anew our texts from antiquity. So, for example, I consulted the writings of Peter Sondy for the way he thinks about knowledge, erkenntnis, and poetic processes, Walter Benjamin for helping release the shackles of generic categories, especially in thinking about lament and tragedy in the Trauspiel, or Nietzsche for his work on ancient composition, and Schlegel for his capacious and provocative work on philology. Their questions and their answers about hermeneutics, translation, and philology have helped me enormously in my own work on these ancient texts and on the history of scholarship. As I considered matters of biblical composition, poetics, and hermeneutics, it became increasingly clear to me that my field was stymied or even compromised by the very 19th century assumptions I mentioned in the introduction of this paper. Approaches to reading and analysis were also burdened by anti-Jewish and supersessionist dogmatic theology and by historicist thinking. It's well known that classics was born as a sibling of biblical studies. Wolff and Eichhorn, as two founding fathers, were essential for these disciplines. But we can, in hindsight, recognize the way in which the humanities have moved beyond the discourse of idealizing, even fetishizing the original moment of production, but more so in the ways in which the establishment of Jewish studies continued to be constrained by older models of hermeneutics and historical reconstruction. This collaboration dissipated through the divisions of the academy between theology and the humanities. But to a great extent, this has been overcome through collaborations, I think, as a series of important programs for culture, history, and religion and antiquity. Much of what needs to be done now is to remove layers of scholarly assumption around matters of source criticism, text criticism, categorization, and genre. As I suggested in my introduction, much of this thinking was shaped by an already established expectation around a late Judaism, Spätjudentum, and a fundamental disdain for the law and for Judaism as a tradition that was dynamic and ever-changing. What I'm suggesting is a series of ways about forward-moving philology, which allows for a capacious definition of philology that was open to thinking between and across poetry, philology, and philosophy. Funnily enough, I've been able to achieve this by building bridges with classics and literary theory. These disciplines, as well as German literature, these three disciplines were in a way born together, but to reconnect them is to create a new form of reciprocity in building. This work across disciplines now challenges the language of crisis in the humanities and instead reminds us that what we do is critique. This critique is at the center of our work as scholars. For that matter, it is as old as the earliest writings, marginalia, and scholarly debate around addition, which date back at least to the Hellenistic period, if not before. It is essential that instead of arguing for a crisis in the humanities that needs to be overcome, I prefer to embrace the challenges of the humanities and through critical evaluation of the history of our own fields, help our disciplines, especially in ancient Jewish studies, biblical studies, and classics, to resonate and contribute to current political and social challenges. It is clear to me that we can rethink our field and its presuppositions concerning method for reading, originary moments as ideal context for reconstruction, and the nature of hermeneutics. There are a number of concepts that I have initiated to try to integrate biblical studies, the field of Hebrew Bible, into the humanities. Each of the central methodological innovations that I've explored are intended to help redirect the field of biblical studies in such a way that it would free itself from a supersessionist history and from historicist philology. My critique then of historical linguistics, of the reconstruction of an urtext or Vorlage, of source criticism, as well as the search for the genuine or historical is differentiated from the disingenuous, are all part of my larger ambition for biblical studies in ancient Judaism. I have pushed hard against a discourse of prophetic ending in Judaism and beyond, because it's clear that the texts themselves, or their authors or communities for that matter, understood themselves to be oracular efficacious, that is, vitality continues. I'd like to speak about philological hermeneutics instead of philology as a science divorced from hermeneutics. The four expressions I shared with you today of vitality hopefully provided a window onto how the life and ongoing transformation of scripture function as an expression of poetic and cultural growth. To study vitality is to practice a philology which is forward moving and which participates in new composition. This is true for Homeric materials, for the Virgilian corpus, but so too for the Mosaic, for the Jeremianic, and for the didactic and liturgical poetic collections that we have. By opening up new pathways, we can explore and consider new scholarly frameworks for reading and understanding the history, literature, and philosophy of Jewish antiquity. We can do that by opening up our eyes and asking hard questions, not only of our ancient writers and interpretive communities, but also by critically evaluating the history of our own field and by interrogating and exposing the presuppositions of approaches that integrate histories of trauma, racism, and bias. We strive to engage the tools and crafts of the academy, new perspectives, and fresh readings. And we also have much to learn about our current modes of reading, interpretation, and politics as we embrace a new humanities that includes and integrates the study of religion and philology. I hope for a future in biblical studies and the ancient world more generally, which is open to receive and rethink our presuppositions. The founders of our field were deeply engaged in philosophy, literary theory, practices of composition, and conversations across disciplines. We have much to learn from these other disciplines, and our future depends on understanding method not as dogma, but as one of a series of approaches we can take. There are new pathways, and we must stay open to new ways of reading, new findings like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Cairo-Geniza that transform our understanding of text, transmission, interpretation, and translation. And with much optimism, I look ahead to a future that will be realized by next generations of readers and thinkers, a generation that thinks poetically and philosophically with the tradition of biblical writings as an integral part of the humanities. It is with that optimism, but also with the recognition of the need for extensive correction of the history of our field that brings me to speak of vitality. It is essential that we interrogate the ways in which ancient texts have been read to accommodate existing narratives. If the Hebrew Bible is read as superseded as the Old Testament, it will be studied retrospectively with a dogmatic burial. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are rendered sectarian and marginal to the history of the development of Judaism, then their contribution to the dynamic voice of Hebrew in the Hellenistic period and Jewish philosophy will be silenced. I believe that the Hellenistic period is a much understudied context for thinking about plurilingualism, revitalization of Judaism in a golden age of philosophical and hermeneutical reflection, as well as scribal patterns of performance and language development, philological development. By shifting our gaze forward to a vital and creative contribution to the development of Judaism, the period of Hellenism and the biblical texts can serve to contribute much to our understanding of the history of Judaism as the development of textuality, philosophy, and the poetic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was delightful. Wow, there's a lot to think about here. That came in, and see what you think. In light of your, or do you want to take a drink of water or take a
No, I'm okay.
breath? Okay. In light of your talk, can you tell us something about your view of canon?
Sure, that's a great question. So, first of all, I don't think that canon is a particularly Jewish concept, and others, others have argued based on even Athanasius' letters that David Brackey, for example, that canon itself is only understood retrospectively. It's not really a central concept in the history of Christianity either, but retrospectively it comes to be very important. We don't really have a discussion of canon. Canon, of course, means a straight line, like a plumb line. It's not really a vibrant and creative collection. On the one hand, we understand that the books of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, become formalized and fixed. On the other hand, to think about the texts that are not in it as non-canonical is a huge mistake, I think, and quite anachronistic. What we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is almost every book of the Hebrew Bible is copied, but then there are many other texts, some of which have far more copies and are also treated in a scriptural way. So I prefer to talk about emerging scriptures and scriptural traditions. There are discussions. There are discussions already in Tannaitic literature about texts that defile the hands as a way of thinking about texts that are holy or are complicated or problematic for a whole variety of reasons, or they need to be put away. The language of lignos to separate it off. And then there's a later discussion in the Babylonian Talmud about authorship. But you don't get the question about canon, about what's in and what's out. And there are many, many texts. For example, the book of Ben Sira is cited throughout the rabbinic literature. So the divide is a very complicated divide. If there's one thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls teach us, is that the term canonical and non-canonical or intertestamental is completely incoherent for the Hellenistic period, and I would say even in the early rabbinic period.
Thank you. That'll help me in the Dead Sea Scrolls course.
Good.
I have another question. Well, this person, first of all, thanks you for coming and sharing your research and your thoughts, and finds your talk fascinating. Is there room to suggest that there is a parallel between Judaic and Hellenistic-Greco thought, in the sense that their epistemology seemed to indicate, quote, interpretation becomes prior to articulation? That's a bit much.
No, it's not a big much. I'm just trying to understand the question exactly. Let me break it down into two parts, if that's okay. So,
Sure.
Their epistemology indicates interpretation. Perhaps this person means interpretation is prior to articulation. I mean, what I mean by articulation in my paper is borrowing from Jeffrey Kahn about articulation as a kind of liturgical performance, a reading out loud. But interpretation is inextricably linked in the Hebrew tradition. They're connected, because to read a text, to vocalize it, to sing it, to articulate it is to interpret it, because the vocalization itself requires interpretation. So I would say that from the very earliest stages, grammar and performance are inextricably linked with interpretation and articulation. And that's something that Jeffrey Kahn would say, that is, the traditions of reading have a kind of oral instruction for how to read and how to understand the text. I hope that answers the question.
If it doesn't, I think the person will write
Okay,
again.
It's a great question. Yeah.
This is from a former student of mine. Do you think the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic text should be given primacy in interpreting the Hebrew Bible? When it comes to textual disagreements, how do we know which manuscript should be used in order to develop a sound hermeneutic?
Right. So I'm going to unravel that question a little bit. So first of all, the Masoretic text, there isn't a Masoretic text. There are Masoretic manuscripts. The Masoretic tradition is later than the Dead Sea Scrolls, although we do see many affinities between the biblical text and the Dead Sea Scrolls with the later Masoretic tradition. So the answer is all of it. It's all relevant to our conversation about interpretation. But we also need to understand the different traditions and the different historical layers and periods from which they're coming. And we must consider, as much as it's possible, the traditions we have in context. So we have to be mindful of later medieval manuscripts and the way in which texts are being vocalized and performed and sung as modes of interpretation. But it's not only medieval manuscripts are doing this. We also have traditions, scribal traditions through spelling, through particular scribal practices, through paragraph or versification that help us already understand interpretation even before we get to something like Pesher or Midrash. So the question is such a complicated question, and it's such an interesting question. So I want to say that we have to be willing to consider all of our information. I mean, if we use the example of 11Q5, the Psalm scroll, for example, the Great Psalm scroll. So we have roughly the same order that we find in the later Masoretic text of Psalms, and yet we have other Psalms that are included, some of which we know from other Greek materials. Sometimes they're brand new interpretive materials, but we find some of these later expressions, for example, in Jewish liturgical traditions. I'll give you one example. There's a text called Eskarech L'Tzion, apostrophe to Zion, which begins Eskarech L'Tzion bracha. Let me remember for you as a blessing, directly addressing Zion. We get poems like this, lamenting the absence of Zion in later liturgical Jewish prayers. This is incredible. It's so interesting. So how is it relevant? Well, it's definitely this is apostrophe to Zion is absolutely interpreting Psalm 136 and passages from Isaiah and Jeremiah. And yet it's included in this Psalm scroll, and we don't have any other copies from it. We have it from Cave 11, and we have another version of it in Cave 4. So we have two slightly different versions of it. It also embeds the Shema in it. In it, it says, B'chol levavi, b'chol modi, with all my heart, with all my might, in this same prayer text. I mean, to return to this wonderful question, what is this? What is this text? What do we do with it? How does it inform? So on the one hand, it's interpreting other texts. On the other hand, it's growing a liturgical text. And it also points forward to later lament texts that remember the temple. So this is how I propose using these vital and vibrant, innovative texts. And maybe one way to kind of return to the question of canon and this question is, but I'm also interested in normative community. That is, we also want to make sense of what religious communities are using. And I don't want to break that. I don't want to break that down. I don't want to problematize that. I want to recognize the traditions that around which religious communities have formed, but also allow ourselves as historians, as philologists, as interpreters, to understand that the history of interpretation is far more complex than normative religious communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. Would you say it is accurate to view Second Temple literature such as Jubilees as a kind of commentary on the biblical texts? Or is it more accurate to view them as vehicles for the development of new traditions within Hellenistic Judaism and later Rabbinic Judaism?
Beautiful question. The answer is, if you can permit me to say, yes and yes. So the second formulation and the second alternative in that question, I want to immediately jump on and say that is what I'm arguing for. And you're absolutely right in the way you've articulated it, right? To talk about it, I think you said vehicles for the development of new traditions. Sure. However, you can't, and I've pushed hard in this talk to say, let's not just reduce it to rewritten Bible. It also does not have what they call a lemma or a quotation with an interpretation. We have texts like that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like Pesher, right? I didn't talk about that tonight. We have moments which begin to look like commentary traditions. And we know in the Hellenistic period, on the Greek side of things, in the pagan world, that they're absolutely already commentary traditions on Homer. Jubilees is interesting because it could interpret Genesis, but it doesn't. It claims to be more than Genesis or before Moses. Moses inherits an already established tradition, which comes from the heavens, which is disseminated to a whole host of people prior to Moses. It's then given to Moses. But Jubilees also talks about, and this is really why I want to say that there is some kind of reading or expanding on Genesis and Exodus. I don't think it's a replacement of Genesis and Exodus. And there are people who have suggested this. I'm not arguing that, but to call it a commentary is kind of too quick and somewhat anachronistic. So on the one hand, I want to recognize that it's reading and interpreting. On the other hand, if we recognize commentary as a lemma or a quotation with an interpretation, it's not that, because it blurs the distinction between the two of them, between a text and its commentary, by writing a new text which changes law, changes practice, introduces new ritual, and fundamentally rewrites the story of Sinai.
The same person wants you to expand more on the idea of Torah existing in heaven, not only before God revealed it to Moses, but even before the world was created.
Right. So I didn't explicitly allude to that tradition, but you're absolutely right that this is a tradition in rabbinic literature, right? That there are different traditions, but there are a number of things that are said to have been created before the creation of the world, kind of awaiting Israel. One of them is the Torah. So it's very interesting claim. And then that would be that it's somehow awaiting Israel. And it's already part of the creation of the world. Part of the intention or the purpose of the world is also wrapped up in the giving of Torah, which is in some sense re-articulated at the time of Moses. Now, Jubilees already claims that the Torah is articulated before the revelation to Moses, because well, insofar as Enoch, one of these, the figure that walked with God and he was no more, he receives the first Torah in the book of Jubilees. He's the first scribe, authoritative scribe. They're transgressive scribes that Jubilees talks about. And then he brings it down, as you will, and then it's transmitted from generation to generation. That's one way that this is addressed. There's something else that I think you heard in my talk, but I didn't really develop it. I've developed it elsewhere. There are other claims in the Hellenistic period where the Torah, it seems, is like the law of nature that organizes creation and the cosmos, the world. The Mosaic Torah is at one with that. So in a sense, the creation of the world is already the creation of the law of nature, and the law of nature is at one with the law of Moses. They're kind of different forms of law. And that's an argument that Philo of Alexandria makes. There's one other way I want to answer your question, and then I realize that there are many more questions, but we can perhaps come back to this. And that's Proverbs 8. Adonai, so God created me at the very beginning. At the very beginning, God created wisdom, chokhmah. And this tradition also is very, very generative for talking about that, God created wisdom before the creation of the world, and then wisdom becomes a kind of helpmeet for God, a kind of partner for God in the creation of the world. And I think this tradition of having wisdom, Torah as wisdom, for example, we see in Psalm 119, this is very much part of that tradition, that there's already wisdom at the beginning of the world, primordial wisdom, which is then articulated or re-articulated through revelation, but it's already part of the organization of the cosmos. And to understand the law correctly is also to understand the heavens and the organization of time and the organization of the secret of being. And here is, I'm also adding another dimension to your question by invoking some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are also interested in this question about, the Torah before Sinai. I guess one other way to think about this, it's before the Torah before Sinai also has another tradition about whether or not the patriarchs knew the Torah or participated in it, which is another rabbinic tradition.
I have one which is a bit of a change of pace. Is 19th century biblical historicism intentionally supersessionist, or does this characterization exist because of the lack of Jews teaching Jewish studies in the 19th century?
Right, so here I would say no and no to the question, those two options. And I like to think a little bit more about, it's a very, very important and complicated challenge for me to explain and for me to return to that part of the paper that I explored. Is Judaism intentionally supersessionist? Are Christians intentionally supersessionist? So the teachings and the understanding of what Judaism is in the history of Western civilization as something that must be superseded, whether it's Kant or whether it's Fichte or whether it's Hegel, that's certainly part of the Western philosophical tradition, which comes very much out of the history of Christian text and interpretation, without a doubt. I think the language of intention, I want to step away from this. Is this part of the way in which Judaism was represented in the academy in the reading of Hebrew Bible? Absolutely. One would read the servant songs in Isaiah as part of a typological anticipation of the Christ. And so even the biblical texts were read with a particular Christian anticipation. And there's more to say about that. I think the fact that Judaism was read and understood in the context of the history of Christianity has a lot to do with why it developed in this way. This is even more complicated because there are many Jews, even today, who would continue to re-articulate views that I would say reinforce this negative characterization of late Judaism, or give up the idea of ongoing prophecy and kind of say that, spirit left Judaism. And you've picked up on something in my paper, which is I'm saying that it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or you are completely unaffiliated with any religious tradition, or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist, you might nevertheless be co-opted by a narrative within the history of scholarship that I'm trying to problematize. So I think this is also important. Baruch Schwartz is a Jew who's arguing for positions that I'm very critical of in the context of 19th century biblical historicism. So and then you asked about Jewish studies. Well, yes, of course, that's important. Does the characterization exist because the lack of Jews teaching Jewish studies? No, because Jews teaching Jewish studies can equally re-articulate these positions, and do to this very day. So my being Jewish, which I am, is part of my critique, but I think that I have many colleagues. There's a volume I've just edited now with a group of colleagues on Protestant anti-Semitism in the field of biblical studies, and 75% of the contributors and half of the editors are not Jewish. So I think that's very important, that the editors themselves and the contributors are not Jewish, but they're worrying about both New Testament studies and Old Testament studies and how to address these issues.
Do you have energy for two more?
I have energy for 10 more. You could take it as long as you like, Randy. It's a wonderful, wonderful community you have here.
We're going to limit it to two. What do you think is the contribution of the Dead Sea Scrolls to your project? Or another way to look at it would be, what did we know about Poesis before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what do we know about it afterwards?
Right. So thank you for that question. Elsewhere, I've written specifically about this question. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is a game changer for biblical studies. The question is whether or not we allow ourselves to learn from it. By calling them sectarian, by saying that they don't really have any real impact, the extra biblical texts, the non-canonical texts are remote and not integrated, is a way of limiting and marginalizing them and the contribution they can make to the history of Judaism. Increasingly, scholarship has come to accept the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls have an enormous amount to teach us about how to read the Hebrew Bible. They are our earliest cache of biblical Hebrew texts. Apart from that, we had here and there an amulet of the priestly blessing. We didn't have manuscripts. We had Greek manuscripts. We didn't have Hebrew manuscripts. So these are transform the way in which we see and we see scribes thinking, thought thinking in front of us, correcting, thinking, writing, producing, creating. And part of my point today in my first argument about vitality is to bring our knowledge now about the relationship between interpretation or hermeneutics and history together and walk backwards into the Pentateuchal materials, because I think that by seeing the relationship between composition, that is history and hermeneutics, we can gain a better understanding of what's going on even in the assembled Pentateuchal texts. It matters. We see it not only in the Masoretic text, which is a much later manuscript than the manuscripts we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we can also see them in multiple Pentateuchal or biblical manuscripts from the Dead Sea.
Great. And the final question, this might be a bit challenging. In your opinion, what are the three most important things we can take away from your talk today?
Thank you. It's such a great opportunity to ask me to kind of name the three most important takeaways. And I mean, of course,
you might want to say four, but this person asked for three.
Yeah, but I what I want to say is that I mean, I would love to know what the people in the audience feel are the things that they are able to take away from. But as a teacher, I would want to say the three things I really wanted to communicate and to emphasize. First, and thank you for asking me that. It's a really lovely question. First, that this period of the Hellenistic period is a period for biblical production and extra biblical production, right? That there are many texts. It's a very creative time. We think of a golden age at the time of Maimonides. I want to say this is already a golden age. And we can see the creation and the dynamic integration of a new culture, like we talk about the Assyrian period or the Persian period. We can also talk about the Hellenistic period as a period that gave life and breath and creativity to ancient Judaism, which would continue. It would be inherited. It would be integrated into the fabric of Judaism moving forward in complicated ways, not necessarily in linear ways. That's the first. The second is, let's be very careful. And this goes back to a series of questions that I was just asked this evening. When we see these texts that are rewriting or interpreting or playing with the biblical materials, let's watch what they're doing. Let's study practices of reading, of prayer, of exegesis, but also of the production of new poems. I want us to study these texts with an eye towards new creative practices of reading and composition, instead of thinking that we already know what they are. And this is the problem. When we find scrolls, when we find new things, we know what we know. It's very hard to develop new histories and new ways of thinking about the literary development of texts and traditions in ancient Judaism. And then the third point, and I think you all know where I'm going with this in the third point. Racism and hatred embedded in the history of Western civilization is something that we as scholars, as students, as lay people have to think about, and think about very, very carefully. How do we use biblical texts? What kind of narratives do we inherit? And what do we problematize? And what do we integrate? And what do we need to refine? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to say the body of classics or a body of biblical texts or early Christianity we can dispose of it, or we can dismiss it as not being relevant because it has embedded within the history, hatred or racism or misogyny, all of those things. But we can nevertheless read and understand our traditions. So when we repeat the scholarship of the past or texts of the past, we can do it in a way that we learn from it. We can cherish our past, but we can also refine it, and we can reflect on it, and we can teach it to our students. And our students can teach it to their students in a way that's critical and nevertheless appreciative of the beauty and the contribution of these texts to the history of Western thinking and philosophical ethics. I think that was three.
That was three. Yeah, you didn't do four. Well, I want to thank you for this stimulating and fascinating and provocative and delightful talk. I've learned a great deal. I think all of us here have learned a great deal. We appreciate your being able to talk to us even over this distance. And the only thing that remains is to have you actually come and do something for us in person. So when things calm down, we would like to have you back.
Thank you.
Until then, thank you for your talk. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Oh, there you are. Oh, there's still 16 people. Let's see. I'm going to wait till, let's see, the number goes down.